Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos because the purpose of this channel is educational in regards to atheist and deconversion issues and any issues related to those issues. A hearty shout out to the Rabyd Nation. Join the nation by hitting that subscribe button, and if you want to buy your citizenship and become a citizenship of this benevolent dictatorship known as the Rabyd Nation, hit your join button and your options will be presented. Membership always helps me and I always appreciate it. My members get a little bit of special treatment. That's just being honest. Today I want to continue on my deconversion story, so I'm going to, this is part 13. I did the overarching thing last week with how my blog factored in, and the reason I told that story is it's going to be in the next 2 or 3 parts probably, where the blog All Things Rabyd kind of is this overlaying work that I did. Okay, so today I want to talk about my second church, which was a congregational church. Last time I left off, I'd been elected, I had started, and I began to do the work of being a pastor in a church that pretty much was independent. I didn't have any denominational leadership. I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted. The doctrinal statement of the church is very, very basic. Basic Christianity, I would consider it, and not much else. So there was a lot of wiggle room for a lot of people, Christians of different stripes, to be there. I mean, probably other faiths wouldn't have felt comfortable, but Christianity was fairly comfortable. So I began my ministry in this church with a different philosophy altogether. I sat down and prayed about it, but really it was me talking to myself, trying to figure out what to do with this particular church, because it was a completely different set of ministry circumstances. I had a church of about 12 to 15 on Sunday morning. That was pretty much the average attendance. I knew they had pretty deep pockets as far as money went, so I wasn't worried about getting paid, at least not for a couple of years anyway. So I began to focus on the long term and what I could do to build the church. And so I began to think, okay, I want a church that any Christian can come in here and be comfortable, unless they're like an extreme fundamentalist and they want to harp on some little detail that doesn't matter. And I also made a commitment to reach out to misfits, people that didn't necessarily fit anywhere else. And one of the unique things about this church, one time I remarked, was I had literally, after the first 2 years, former everything was in front of me. I had former Catholics, I had former Baptists, I had former Methodists, Lutherans, I had former Pentecostals, Charismatics, you name it. I even had a Presbyterian, former Presbyterian, a former Episcopal, Catholic Church Light, basically. I had all these different faiths in front of me, and so I began to become acquainted with what I would call more a liturgical style of service, where I had an order of service that was pretty much the same every week, but I would dump different things in it, change things up. But there was a musical, repetitious liturgy, and there was certain prayers and things that did that. But there was also room for me to be creative within that, and so I began to work on changing it ever so slightly here and there just to make it fit, changing the order just a little bit, put the announcements up front, the offering way at the back, at the end of the service, things like that, just small things. Another commitment that I made was to small groups. I managed to start a small group in somebody's home. It grew actually quite large. I think the largest we had was 20, and it was at that point I said, hey, can we make 2 groups? And that didn't fly. The people did not want to give up their friendships, and I was too successful in one aspect, in that I was focusing very much on fellowship being the mortar that held everything together. Now, I was also focused on practical preaching. I didn't want preaching that didn't have a practical, this is how you do something, edge. I focused on my strengths, so I started a Bible study in the evening. And of course I taught Life of Christ first thing, and I had the same problems with it. In fact, they were magnified. I then also did another study in comparative religions, okay, where I began to compare all the religions, and the chorus bit, the basic, this is why we reject all these other traditions. And then I got to my own faith, and I became painfully aware that if I applied the same criticisms to all the other faiths, that my own faith would also probably fail. That became the impetus of why, I would eventually start my blog in a search for, theological truth and the truth of Christianity, which would eventually fail. This was kind of, pretty enlightening. I had some really good times with my family. My kids were all in high school, so I really enjoyed that time. I got to watch both my sons play football. I got to watch my daughter play basketball, and all of them did fairly well in school. Didn't really have a lot of issues with them, except for a few here and there with every single one of them, and just enjoying life. We were living at my mom's home, and we were helping her pay the bills, do stuff around the house, things like that. And then I was preaching in the church. And so we ended up, with this, moving forward kind of attitude. And I had some success with it. The average attendance moved from 12 to 15 to about 35 to 40. And I had a high water mark of 56 people on an Easter Sunday. It was a real good moment. Most people hadn't seen the church that full before in years. The church could hold about 120, so it was still only half full, but it was still, everybody was kind of thrilled about it. That day was also a church picnic. I baptized 7 people in the river, and I didn't baptize them by dunking them under. I did what's called infusion. I just picked up the water, put it over the head, which in one young lady's case, I'm kind of glad for that, because I'm fairly certain if I had dunked her under, we would have had some sort of show. But as it was, it turned out all right. I had a fantastic organist, and even better pianist. The organist was very classically minded with his music and stuff, and did a lot of the liturgical stuff. And then I had my pianist, who was really, really good with, like gospel kind of stuff. And we had a choir, and we became known as a pretty damn good choir, and we would sing, and I joined it. I'd never sung in the choir before. Really enjoyed that. And it was just good stuff, good years from a practical side of things. And this lasted, probably till 2013, 14. Oh, one other thing, we ran a shepherd's table where we fed people. In the early part of that, we had 50, 60 people at our shepherd's table in an area that could only really hold about 60 people. But at the time, the economic downturn was pretty heavy at that point, and we were actually helping a lot of people that were really struggling. We only served one hot meal a week, but it was, sometimes these people were very grateful for what we did. And I felt like we were doing good work. We were fulfilling the mission of Christ. We were going forward, whatever it was. And then, but the questions still remained. The things in the back of my head kept rattling around, the inconsistencies of the scriptures, the fact that I felt that none of the arguments for the existence of God really were conclusive, some worse than others, but even the best of them was flawed. I kept searching for my own arguments for the existence of God. I began to start thinking I needed to practice my theology, and so I started All Things Rabyd in 2013, and I began this back and forth with ministry and the blog. And it was also about those times that some of the political problems reared their ugly head, and the fact that I was trying to make some serious big changes to the church at that point. I'd been there 4 years, 5 years, and I felt I had earned the right to kind of change some things. But congregational government is finicky, and I had one guy that was adamantly opposed to things, and whispering campaigns would start, and anything I would try to start, it would fall apart. I tried to start a contemporary service at a later time, but nobody came because the whispering campaign was pretty hard. We don't need it, whatever. I really had this one guy that I would later identify as sociopathic. That he liked to be in control, and if there was stuff that he liked, he would back it. If he didn't like it, he would try to sabotage it. If it wasn't his idea, he didn't really like it. And this was the same guy that pushed the other guy out at the beginning. And I began to run into problems with him. Although we maintained a pretty good friendship, although his sociopathic tendencies, his desire to control things, kind of began to really eat at me. So on the one hand, I'm having some initial ministry struggles with the church, and on the other hand, I'm struggling with my theology and all the rest of it. And I began to write all things Rabyd, starting to address the hot topics. My whole thing was to try to find a true theology, try to find a practical theology that worked, that made God make sense. And every time I would reach, it was also a biblical theology, if you understand what that means. Biblical theology is theology where you just use the Bible and try to eliminate all a priori assumptions. It doesn't mean you don't do a historical or cultural analysis of the time period, but I began to run into a lot of the same problems with that. I was going to take on the hard issues with that blog, and I did. And, writing out my sermons became part of that process too, because I would preach on things I had questions about myself. I would write on things that I had questions about myself. I was having some, the good years were starting to wind down. Some people would say I probably had a 3, 4, or 5 year honeymoon period with the church, but it didn't last as well as it did. It was at this point that I also realized that the church couldn't support me, and so I went back to school, and I started back at Ferris State University here nearby in Big Rapids. I began to work on a political science degree in 2014, and was my fall of 2014 was my first semester. And my goal was, I was just going to at the time I was like, man, I'm going to need a job on the side if I'm going to stay at this church. That was the initial thought. But within a year, the goal changed quite radically. It became more of, I need another job because I can't do this one anymore. Okay, so it became a more of a imperative. And so for 2013, 14, and about half of 2015, I really wrestled with the church. I wrestled with my own personal issues. I'm fairly certain now that the autism was rearing its ugly head, because when I'm under stress, I don't make really great decisions. Okay, I have to de-stress before I make decisions. This is one of my coping things now that I really do. Before I make a major decision, I sit down, de-stress, really think about it in a more calm frame of mind. And if I don't do that, I have a tendency to make very bad decisions. And so, because my nervous system is overloaded. And it's getting worse as I get older, so I keep that in mind. Starting to do things that I enjoy doing helps, but at the time I didn't know that. And so the whole wrestling with my belief is stressing me out. The church is stressing me out. Thankfully, my kids by this time had all graduated, but they were engaged in other things. My daughter got married. Later on, my son would get married, and so there was things going on there as well. And, I'll talk more about that later, and probably in the next video, where, the things really fell apart. But I started preaching a series of messages on Corinthians. At this time, I was reading a lot of atheists. I was reading Krauss, A Universe from Nothing. I was reading a lot of Christopher Hitchens. I read Dawkins's The God Delusion. I was engaged with Dan Barker, his book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All of Fiction. Idea. I began to read these, and I began to read what atheism really was. This is one of the things that I do better than most of the theists that come onto this channel. And I say that I love you all theists, but some of you are just awful about this. I actually decided to listen to the atheists. I began to listen to various atheists on YouTube, things like that. I began to actually genuinely listen. And I let atheism define itself, which is a rarity. Most people that are apologists want to define what atheism is and then attack that and then wonder why atheists get mad at them or they get frustrated because no atheist converts. It's because you're not listening. Okay, I decided to listen. I began to listen to the atheists. Okay, so what they're saying is they don't have sufficient evidence to believe. Okay, I can buy that. Now, like everybody else in Christendom, I want to grab Romans 1, 18 through 20, but I began to think to myself, that doesn't really help, because I can say that to them, but it's just going to piss them off, okay? And two, that's not what they think, okay? And if you're going to reach somebody with your ideas, you have to find out what they think and what their defining things are. You have to play on their court, okay? You literally have to step onto their field and engage it with your own ideas. And I started to do that. And I was really wrestling it, and I was listening to Dan Barker, one of his videos, one of his debates, and he makes the statement, sin is an imaginary problem. Sin doesn't exist. It's an imaginary problem, and salvation through Jesus Christ then is an imaginary solution to an imaginary problem. It's made up. And, I could have ran to my Bible, but I realized he's making that assumption without biblical because he doesn't understand the Bible, okay? Or that's what I was thinking at the time. He doesn't accept it anyway. So how do I prove sin exists empirically without using the Bible? And I suddenly began to realize that I was in a real pickle. I was debating with myself whether sin was even real. It was going back and forth, which is a big issue if you're going to remain a Christian or any other religion that maintains sin as a reality, from Judaism to Islam and everything in between that, Christianity as well. So I began to wrestle with this question, and I started preaching a series of messages on 1 Corinthians called Life at the Crossroads. It turned out to be, well, shall we say, a prophetic title. I was really wrestling with Paul in 1 Corinthians. A lot of his advice seemed bad. His notion that somehow, that he had this knowledge that other people didn't have, that God really didn't have a good apologetic for himself. He was just trying to, use the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, so to speak. And I got to chapter 5, and chapter 5 is about where he's talking about fornication in the church and how sin can corrupt. There's a line in there, a little leaven's the whole lump. And so the tenor of my message as I prepared it was the practical side of how that sin can create a lot of problems in the church, regardless of whether it was fornication or not. I didn't know that I had fornication in my church. I didn't care. What people did outside the walls of the church was pretty much their business. I mean, the membership requirements of this church were so basic. You only really had to show up once a year, really, if even that. You didn't actually have to attend or give or anything. You could just be a member. And so it was really, I really had to just encourage good behavior. There was no way to twist anybody's arm with it. So I was encouraging getting rid of sin in the church, realizing the kind of church that I had, and that the only thing I could do was encourage them to do it and do everything else. So I'm trying to get across the importance of how sin can damage and destroy good relationships and fellowship and everything else. And at the same time, I got this Dan Barker quote rolling in my head about whether sin's even a reality. And on May 10th, 2015, I now know the date because I went through my blog. It was something I did not remember. I remember the aftermath of that message, but I didn't remember the exact message or what the point was. Once I found it. Oh, yeah, all the lights came back on. My memory has been restored. I'm getting old. But anyway, so I'm preaching this message called The Purity Police, going at it about how sin is, and I had gotten up before and I said, God, if you're there, and I'm not sure you are, you need to show me how I can empirically prove sin, the reality of sin, without using the Bible. And I realized that all the arguments for the existence of God were fuzzy in the first place. The Bible is a flawed book, knew that. So I'm like, there's a whole bunch of things I can't verify empirically at all. I can't verify the existence of God, whether the Bible is the Word of God. I'd already gone through some stuff on inspiration and realized that all the viewpoints of inspiration just don't work. And so I'm standing there and I'm preaching my message. I'm trying to get across the importance of sin, while at the same time my head is going, is sin even real? And I'm like, God, you got to reveal to me how to do this because I'm at my wit's end here. I can't see a way out of this. My rational mind was basically saying sin doesn't exist. My emotions and desire to keep to my faith because I wanted to see my Father again. I wanted, to be in fellowship with all these wonderful people. I had wonderful people in this church for the most part. And I'm like, can I even do this if I don't believe in Christianity anymore? It was a real struggle for me. And I'm preaching this message, and I'm preaching and preaching. Most of my message is about 20 minutes. By this time, I had gained a reputation for being a very passionate, practical preacher, and a fairly decent one, I guess. And then I got to the end, and I realized I hadn't heard from God. I had no reason empirically to believe that God was real, at least at that point. I certainly felt the whole issue of Christianity, the life of Christ thing with Christ had really kind of, good grief, did Jesus actually do any of this stuff? Okay, did he actually exist? Became another question. And if he doesn't exist and God isn't real, then God doesn't give commandments. And if commandments aren't given, there is no sin. So sin is a non-reality. And then thus imaginary, and Jesus is the imaginary solution to that problem. I'm like, son of a bitch, Dan Barker's right. And I finished my message, gave the service over to the worship leader. I sat down, and I said it again. Son of a bitch, Ed. Dan Barker's right. Sin doesn't exist. Salvation through Christ doesn't exist. It's all fairy tale. God's questionable. The Bible is not a holy book. It's a book full of holes. And this is where it really got tough. Because I said, you know what, Ed? The real problem here is you try to be an honest person. And right now, you make your money by convincing people that they're sinners in need of the grace of God. They pray prayers with you. You tell them how to get back on God's good side, whatever, these practical messages you preach. And in gratitude, they throw their money in the basket. That's how you're paid. You're paid on a fairy tale, on an imaginative story from ancient antiquity that you've decided to believe that has no evidence for it, or very little. And I'm sitting there, and I became probably one of the most miserable people in that moment that you could ever imagine, because I suddenly realized that all faith that I had in Christianity and Jesus, and pretty damn close to God, his existence, was pretty much gone. I realized that I had spent a large chunk of my life following this and then being a pastor in it. And I'm like, Ed, you've been doing this for 17 years. What are you going to do now? And by this time, of course, I was in school, and I had just finished up my first year. And I said, you've got to change the goal here. You need to get this degree and stuff done so that you can find a different job, because you can't do this anymore. You've got to quit sooner or later. And I felt instantly trapped, immediately stressed out. Because I'm like, well, nobody can know this. I can't tell anybody. I can't even tell my wife. Which tells you something about our relationship. And I suddenly found myself very alone. And I had read Daniel Dennett's book. He wrote it with somebody, caught in the pulpit. And I'd read that book. And it now hit home. And I had heard about the Clergy Project, but I said, I can't do it. I'm not an atheist. At least at the time I wasn't. So I still believe there's got to be a God or something, but Christianity is dead to me. I know that it's a false religion, just as false as all the rest of them. It was at that moment I probably became a deist. A very light deist, but a deist nonetheless. It was all I had left, that there is some sort of higher power that did all this stuff and designed all this stuff and all that crap. And I was pretty miserable at that moment. And the good years would give way to the bad years, the very bad years. And where I would become first a deist and then eventually an atheist pastor. But that's the subject of the next video, and I'll get to that next time. But I just want to emphasize, this is where my real stress began. And now I know that being autistic, this is where my nervous system every day gets more and more overloaded until it finally eventually explodes. And that's when things will end. Well, I'm going to end it there. We'll pick it up here and we'll talk about the remainder of my time in my church number 3 to the end. And so at this point, thank you for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, subscribe. You guys are really helping the channel. The watch hours keep growing every day. We'll get there eventually. They're starting to grow a little bit faster the more subscribers I get. So thank you all that have newly subscribed. Everybody, most appreciated. And as always, just a reminder to live your best life. Search for your own happiness. You only get one go around and then it's over and you're done. There is no afterlife, so don't waste your time on the trappings of faith and religion. Don't give up your opportunities. Don't give up your money. Don't give up your time to something that's false and can't prove itself. Instead, give yourself to yourself and your friends and your family, the people that you love, and try to build a better world. I think you'll be happy for it. In fact, I know you will, and I speak from experience. Thanks once again for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.